Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us at the inaugural lecture of the Critical Companion series by the Sydney Environment Institute. My name is Abbas El-Zein, and I am Professor of Environmental Engineering at the School of Civil Engineering of the University of Sydney. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the Camperdown campus of the University of Sydney is located, the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future, and remind us that sovereignty was never ceded. Please feel free to acknowledge in the chat window Indigenous owners of the sites where you happen to be, especially if they are other than the Cadigal people. Now, country acknowledgement is especially important, I think, in a talk about land and oceans and the delicate interface between them. I still remember when I first arrived in Australia in 1995, in the first week or so, before I've had the chance to see the bush and the outback and other remarkable aspects of this, incredible continent, there were two aspects that I found wonderfully fascinating and rather incomprehensible. The first one was the exquisitely sonorous names of places in highway signs and maps, Tamarama, Wulumulu, Parramatta, Wagga Wagga. And the second were those two quietly beautiful rock pools right next to the ocean in Bondi and Coogee that I'd never seen the likes before. Now, they were incomprehensible because I didn't understand back then why you would want to swim in a pool right next to the ocean instead of dipping straight into the sea. My experience of the sea had been shaped by the rather gentle Mediterranean, and I had no idea back then about the surf and the violent waves of the Pacific Ocean. Of course, a few bruises later, I'd learned my lesson. But ocean pools are one of the landmarks of Sydney. I now like to show friends visiting from overseas. So when the wonderful Michelle Saint-Anne from the Sydney Environment Institute asked me whether I'd be interested in moderating a talk by Nicole Larkin about ocean pools, I looked up Nicole's work and did not hesitate in saying yes. Nicole is an artist and an architect who has exhibited work at the Sculpture by the Sea event in Sydney in 2013 and 2016. You can see footage, by the way, of her work, Dynamics and Impermanence, the one in 2016. You can see footage of that on YouTube, and it's recommended, it's highly recommended. So Nicole, despite graduating from the University of Sydney only 7 years ago, has already received several awards and grants for her work, including Young Australian Designers of the Year Award. I'm reading now the awards for sustainable design, Australian Timber Design Award, and University of Sydney Alumni Award. Of course, most relevant for tonight's talk is that Nicole has been documenting and researching ocean pools for the last few years in a project that has rightly received significant attention in the media, including The Guardian and the ABC. So we're in for a treat this afternoon. Now, before I hand over to Nicole, just a few housekeeping matters. Nicole will be speaking to us for about 45 minutes, after which I will comment on the talk for 5 minutes, just share some reflections, then open the floor to questions. Please enter your questions in the chat in Zoom during the talk. We will be looking at them. We will be sorting through them, if you like, and we will try to go through as many of them as possible during the question time. Now, feel free also to comment in chat, but if you're writing a question, please try and keep it to the point to help us in the Q&A. Also, please make sure that your microphones are on mute, and that's all I have. Nicole, it's all yours.
Thanks, Abbas. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the series. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people, and also just a broad note that my research on ocean pools is a very small fragment of time, and a lot of them have a deep history with Aboriginal people in Australia, which is a topic I would like to go into more if I had the time. So as Abbas said, I'm a practicing architect based in Sydney, and I work across design, architecture, and urban planning. And in 2014, I launched the Wild Edge, which was my research project looking into ocean pools. Through the project, I mapped all 60 ocean pools in New South Wales and created a framework for understanding this typology. So today I'm going to talk about how I set up that framework and about the mapping I undertook as part of this. And I'll also discuss the findings and how they've translated into more recent work, which touches on much broader issues of coastal management in New South Wales. So ocean pools, by their nature, are really simple structures. They sit in the intertidal zone, and they offer kind of a unique and protected access to the ocean. I have my own definition of them, which is simple interventions, and they're really byproducts of our love affair with the beach. From an architect's perspective, we see everything through the lens of built fabric, and if our built fabric speaks of how we connect with our surroundings, ocean pools talk of, Australia's love affair with the ocean. The ocean pools are also pretty important hubs of recreation and community activation in New South Wales. Each one is typically attached to a surf club or a swimming club, and they respond to quite complex challenges occupying a coastline, which is a constantly changing space. They're quite efficient pieces of infrastructure. None of them are major aquatic centres. They're usually a simple concrete wall, although we do have examples like icebergs, which are what we call a formalised pool. But all of them share in common that they're well loved and well used by the communities that they serve. And they facilitate safe and inclusive access to the ocean, which is also an important part of the community. So many of these pools were built in the early 20s as public works projects during the Depression. And when we talk about fostering economic stimulus, these were the kind of projects that the state government looked to post-World War I. They were optimistic and idealistic, and they delivered community-based assets at that time, which is quite poignant given our current circumstances. So the resources that they invested then created this prevalence of coastal infrastructure, which we have today, and which continues to be a really unique and prized collection of assets in New South Wales. So this is a picture of Bronte Bars, which was built much earlier than the 20s. It was built in 1887. Alec Wickham was a forefather of the Australian crawl, which was a stroke he practiced at Bronte Bars, and which has since more commonly been known as freestyle. So Bronte Bars is really one of those pools that's at the heart of Australian culture and the birth of swimming in Australia. Bronte Bars are still hugely popular today, and they're used year-round. They're even used during the evening for night swimming. There's a big light that goes on, and in a hot evening, you can go down after work and have a dip. Bronte's currently being assessed for significance on the State Heritage Register for all those reasons. This is a photo from 2016 when we had one of our now regular East Coast lows. Many ocean pools are sort of becoming fragile due to their age, and their construction is rudimentary, and they're in a quite harsh environment. So they're frequently under repair, and some of them are definitely at risk of being lost in the face of sea level rise and increasingly severe storm surges. So issues like this were the catalyst for my project. I was thinking about what the future of ocean pools would look like in New South Wales if we're going to deal with sea level rise and storm surge. Are we going to lose these assets? What can we do to protect them, and what are the steps that we take to do that? So the idea of this project was to provide sufficient information for us as a community to answer that question. And key to understanding what ocean pools should be is understanding what they are and why they're so valued by the community in New South Wales. So this was my starting point, and to understand and document this, I created a framework based on analysis of existing ocean pools and their context. And broadly, this encompasses two things. the natural and built environment, so the natural landscape, but also the actual built form of the pool, but also the social and community values. So what does the community value about ocean pools? And I went to investigate that from there through mapping and analysis. So basically going back and forward between those things and trying to create connections. The first objective was to understand what the community values around ocean pools and how this plays out in their built form, siting and materiality. So what are the key characteristics of ocean pools? I'll speak about this first. So to map the characteristics of the natural and built environment, I required survey information of each pool in New South Wales. I created a focus study of the 60 ocean-facing ocean pools. There's, of course, a much broader scope that you can take where there's about 120 swimming enclosures in New South Wales, and that includes netted enclosures, harbour pools, ring of rocks, and they're all still valid and important things to look at. And in this case, I didn't look at them just because I needed to keep my scope defined. So I was able to look at all of these pools using a combination of mapping software and drones, and it meant that as a single person, I could generate 3D survey data of each of them efficiently and inexpensively. So to give you an idea of how this worked, I've used Whale Beach Ocean Pool as an example. This is on the northern beaches in New South Wales. I used a drone to take a grid of aerial photos at each pool I went to. So you fly in one direction and then the other, taking as many photos as you can. And each of the images overlaps the next so that the software can find multiple common points. And the way the software works is to basically triangulate various points in space. So it's sort of like trigonometry calculations multiplied 1 million times over. And it's creating spatial information from photographs, which is actually quite an old technology. It's just that now that we can use it with drones, which have GPS locations in them, it's become a lot more effective. So I'll just run this video a couple of times so you get an opportunity to see it. But what this is showing is the product of my mapping, which we call a point cloud. So all the photos are showed above, and there's also a collection of dots below. And that's all those trigonometry points that I was talking about. And what it gives you is a really rich data set. You can see a lot of detail is captured in there. And it's the sort of detail that you would never be able to catch through traditional survey methods, which are also quite time intensive. This survey took me 20 minutes on site to capture, and it's a huge amount of really rich data. That survey data was really powerful, and it was possible for me to capture it for all 60 pools in a 6-week period. And all of that information is freely available online through my research now as well. And I'll just walk you through the way that I use that data to really understand the context and the built form of these pools in detail. This is the Bogey Hole, which is Australia's, well, post-colonial oldest ocean pool. It's 200 years old. It's also incredibly well loved and well used, and quite an iconic pool because it is completely exposed on the rock platform and can give you a stunning experience of the coast. I surveyed this pool and created a 3D model, which is what you see at the moment, and was able to cut sections through those 3D models to really understand what is happening with the rock platform and the pool in detail. So this series of images is analysis I undertook to plot the tide level, so the mean high water mark, the low tide and high tide, and then the wall crest. And all of that analysis is really important because it allows me to understand where the pool sits in relation to the tides, and that's a critical part of how all ocean pools work. It's about how they flush, whether the water's getting in and out, and how protected they are, so how protected people are in the pool when there's a high swell on. This image shows all 60 ocean pools together, oriented north and scaled at the same size. This kind of mapping, where you can see all of the pools together, allows them to be read as a whole and starts to allow us to analyze outliers and patterns. So this is the result of all of the mapping that I did, and really the information that I was looking for to start coming to some interesting conclusions about ocean pool typology. So you might be able to start to understand rectilinear pools versus organic pools, and what their prevalence is. Basically, I'm just demonstrating how that data was incredibly useful in understanding ocean pools as a whole. It's one thing to understand a small collection of these pools, but what's really important is to see them as an entire typology. In New South Wales, we have a greater concentration of ocean pools than anywhere else in the world, and that in and of itself says something about our connection with the water, but also how we interface with our coastlines. So understanding this information is really valuable, and how each of the pools have developed differently in different regions says different things about that. This is some of the different ways that you can look at them, grouping them in by size or circumference, and that analysis has been really useful for understanding broader topics. This is a series of the pools in Newcastle. So they have not only the oldest, but also the biggest ocean pools. And from that, you can understand that the geology of that region is quite significant. They have broad, flat rock platforms, which allowed them to do those spectacular large-scale pools. And all this is to sort of just say that, you know, it allows us to identify those key characteristics of the typology as a whole. The second part of the analysis is then to understand what the community values about these characteristics. So this aspect of the analysis is based on principles from the Burra Charter. And the Burra Charter is a document which sets out best practice guidelines for heritage significance in the natural and built environment. The Charter provides a formal framework for understanding and protecting valued aspects of the natural and built environment in Australia. Many of our ocean pools have been listed either as locally or state significant over the years. And a key factor in all of these listings is the natural beauty of the ocean pools. So what we really value is where they are in the landscape and how they frame it. So I did a review of all of the heritage listings for ocean pools, and the records document that our collective community value for ocean pool really resides in the unique experiences they facilitate with the natural coastal landscape. But this doesn't necessarily mean, for instance, that the best examples of ocean pools are those which disappear into the rock platform and the tidal zone, although this characteristic is definitely what makes Bermagui Blue Pool exemplary for existence. Bermagui Blue Pool is the one that you see on the right. It's down south, about 6 hours south of Sydney. It's a stunning pool and quite iconic. It's featured quite heavily both in social media and in tourism in New South Wales. So these two contrasting examples are shown because they're both well valued and iconic pools, despite one being quite naturalised and one being what I call quite formal, which is icebergs, Bondi icebergs on the left. But what's significant about them both is that they both facilitate a heightened experience with the coastal landscape. So generally, this is governed by how the pool frames the foreshore, how it facilitates a connection with the water's edge, how it allows you to immerse in the ocean, and how it enhances our relationship with coastal landscapes. And I showed these two examples side by side, basically to say that happens in very different ways. And we have very different values which we place on these two pools. One is in a highly dense urban area, which has to facilitate heavy maintenance and safety. And the other one is in a secluded, open, natural setting, which gets a lot less usage, but you know, is equally as loved and iconic as the other. So this balance is a defining characteristic of the typology, and it really sets up the spectrum of how formalized versus how natural our ocean pools are. So to understand this further, I assessed and plotted on a scale each of the ocean pools in New South Wales, and this scatter graph has two axes. One of them is how secluded the pool is versus how activated it is. So whether it's in a remote location or whether it's in a dense urban location. And the other axis plotted it based on how natural, so how much it is within the landscape and how much it is formalized. So how much of it is built concrete, are the steps concrete, is the bottom of the pool floor concreted, or is it mostly the rock platform and there's just a small amount of concrete enclosing the swimming area? What this analysis really communicates and the mapping process that's been undertaken is the drivers that shape ocean pools as a typology. So you can see that they're really being shaped by the amenity and activation required, balanced with the natural landscape and seclusion of the area. So there were three clusters that emerged when I did this analysis. Some pools were quite secluded and natural. Some were secluded but formalized, so they were more concrete, and some were activated and formalized. And that is, icebergs is a perfect example of that. There weren't many examples that were activated and natural, and that's because most of the pools that are more natural, they just can't sustain high usage because they can't be maintained. For instance, if you had quite a natural pool that was being heavily used, every time that you maintain it, it's an incredible amount of resources because you are having to clean a rock platform rather than cleaning a concrete-based pool. So that's why you don't get those examples cropping up very much. And this analysis in this graph, as an extension, describes our relationship with the coast more broadly. So ocean pools in some ways are an analogue of this relationship, and a really useful one. It foregrounds how otherwise competing forces can coexist in coastal areas and enhance one another. So most coastal areas at the moment have a great deal of competing pressures on them, both as a result of our desire to live near the coast, but the byproduct of that being that it puts incredible pressure on the environmental processes there. And it's also a place of constant change, and the fact that we put our settlements so close to the coast is in direct competition with that. So in light of that, I'd like to finish the second half of my presentation by taking these fundamental ideas that we can learn from ocean pools and starting to understand how we can apply them. And two projects I want to discuss to address how we inhabit the water's edge. Both have an understanding, both understand that in a place of constant ebb and flow at that water's edge, hard boundaries of every kind are really a threat. And I'm talking about coastal hazards and critical issues which are coming to a head at the moment in New South Wales. So both projects, they're of very different scales. One of them relates to the entire New South Wales coast, and another is a single project in Port Macquarie. And more recently, the focus of my work has been centering on this issue. So the first project I wanted to talk about was the New South Wales Coastal Design Guidelines. This was initially a Department of Planning document that was published in 2004, and I collaborated with Realm Studios, a landscape architecture and urban design firm in Sydney, to do a revision of these guidelines. And their purpose is to provide guidance on best practice planning and urban design in the coastal region. The guideline focused, among other strategies, on the unique pressures which act on coastal communities in New South Wales. And we provided a series of strategies to deal with this. The aim was to harness the many complex factors which converge on the coast to deliver net positive outcomes. So we understood that the coastline is a place where many factors are converging, and that is creating a pressure, but where there's issues are also opportunities, and how do we leverage that to deliver maximum benefit for our coastal communities. So it was as much about ensuring the significant coastal works delivered it was as much about ensuring that significant coastal works that we're delivering offer community benefit, as ensuring that they navigate really complex socio-political issues which often polarize coastal communities. So some of the examples of strategies we proposed in this guideline included the delivery of cycleways and public foreshore access in conjunction with coastal protection works, contributing community congregation points and emergency response facilities to bushfire-prone coastal settlements, using coastal projects to contribute to the economic agency and cultural vibrancy of local Aboriginal land councils, and the consolidation and diversification of housing typologies away from coastal risks. And these are the sort of key strategies that we felt not only embraced or enhanced the coastal characters of New South Wales, but also delivered a lot of benefit to the community. And part of it seems like a simplistic idea to say, make sure that when you're delivering coastal infrastructure, you're delivering community outcomes as well. But part of the complexity of that is that it's going across lots of different government agencies and lots of different aspects of the community. But that deep complexity is an innate part of the coastline, and we need to be able to operate on that spectrum if we're to create outcomes which sort of bridge all of these different aspects of coastal communities and coastal hazards. So the guideline advocates not only to protect the coastal landscape, but also to enhance them socially, environmentally, and economically. So in essence, we were advocating for a triple bottom line approach. This document's not yet public, but when it goes out, it will form part of the assessment process for development within the coastal zone in New South Wales. The second project I wanted to talk about is in Port Macquarie in New South Wales. It's about 5.5 hours north of Sydney. Port Macquarie is one of our larger coastal settlements. It does have an ageing population, and they were also hit quite hard by the fires earlier this year. Their coastline is quite treacherous. There have been a couple of unfortunate incidents over the last year, a shark attack and some backpackers who drowned in the area. So the community have long campaigned for a new ocean pool to be built in the area to create a protected and safe swimming enclosure. After looking at 7 different prospective sites, we selected Oxley Beach as the location for the new ocean pool. It's just south of Town Beach and ended up being a perfect location for this proposed pool. This is an artist's impression of the proposed pool, and some of the key aspects of this project are actually the non-tangible aspects of it. So as a community-based project, this wasn't council wasn't the proponent of this project, but the community wanted to make sure that it gave back socially. So what they've done is arranged for the land which the pool will be located on to be transferred from Crown back to the local Aboriginal Land Council. So this project has actually become a vehicle for transferring governance and land ownership. And that's something that coastal projects have a huge capacity to do because so much of coastal land is Crown land. So the ongoing upkeep and governance of the pool will be through the community and the council, but the actual land ownership will return back to the local Aboriginal Land Council and the traditional landowners. Some of the actual tangible outcomes of the pool were driven quite heavily by the natural landscape. So the pool has been designed to fit within the natural topography of the headland. And we worked quite hard to make sure that it was a facility that could be used by a broad cross-section of the local community. There's provisions for vision impaired swimmers. A lot of people with vision impairment really struggle to get down to the coastline, and a lot of our beaches are in fact not very inclusive or universally accessible. So this project, it was really important that we were able to get access all the way down to the water, which we did. And in fact, you can get access straight into the pool even if you're in a wheelchair. There's 2 lanes protected near the rock platform, which are for vision impaired swimmers. So what that means is they're semi-enclosed and they're 25 metres in length. And that just helps people with vision impairment feel safe and secure and protected, and be able to swim lengths and access the ocean without feeling unsafe. There's a children's zone which connects to the rock platform. So the idea is that it encourages exploration and engagement with the marine life. And there's also an entry which allows rehabilitation and recreational leisure swimming, which facilitates that older section of the community who, you know, will use the pool for more than just doing laps, but it sort of facilitates if they have a bit of, if they're unable to do that in a confident way. So on a much finer scale, this project is focused on the protection and enhancement of the landscape, and really focused at serving a broad section of the coastal community and their uses of the pool. The next phase of this project will be detailed design and council approval of the scheme if it goes ahead. I just want to finish the presentation focusing on Wamberal. It's a case which highlights the intense pressures and opportunities which coastal communities face in New South Wales, obviously. And issues like this call for quite a considered response and a shift in the way that we're approaching coastal infrastructure management. These projects really need to address deep socio-political and environmental issues going forward. So my understanding of Wamberal is that it's a case of the community almost opposing some of these foreshore residences, which are in a really critical situation where the sands are eroding under the houses. And the difficulty that state government and councils face in trying to manage this whole issue is formidable. And the biggest barrier is not the physical built form, it's really those socio-political issues. How do you move forward on this project when it's polarising? How do you get support, and how do you make sure that it's benefiting more than just a small cross-section of the community? And at the heart of all of this is those questions of what does future coastal protection look like, and how do our engineered foreshores serve the community and permit natural processes to occur? And how do they protect and enhance what we value most about our coastlines? So I bring up these projects because I think that ocean pools, like I said, are a real analogue of what we value about the community and what's important to retain. But they sort of also show a path forward on how we should be managing our coastlines. We don't want to, if we over-engineer them and over-formalise them, that's a departure from what we love about our coastlines. But they also show that there is a way forward. It can be reconciled. Built form can protect and enhance the coastline, and those natural and built factors can really work to enhance one another and complement one another. So thanks very much for your attention today. My research is all freely available online on my website, nicolelarkin.com. And if you want any information, please feel free to go there and have a look. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Nicole. It's a wonderful talk and wonderful insights. I just want to, I prepared a few notes to, you know, to talk about, to comment on your talk, but I've completely discarded them now because I found just, you know, your talk was overwhelming. It was fantastic, and I think it's very hard to say, to add to what you say. The only thing that I want to say is that from my neck of the wood, looking at sea level rise and adaptation to sea level rise, as you said, in this country, we've been building, we have a tradition of building very close to the foreshore on the sand dunes. And we have not in the past been, we haven't appreciated in the past the impact that this has on the ecology, partly because the impacts are slow, incremental, intergenerational, so hard to perceive within one generation. But the debate on sea level rise is initially the way it was framed. If you look at the debate about 10 years ago, it was mostly, when it came to local council, it was mostly framed in terms of looking at the values of assets, and mostly private assets, although there was some work on infrastructure as well, and what the impact of sea level rise is going to have on that. More recently, fortunately, there's a lot more work on asking broader questions, not just about what are the assets that we own, but what does the coast mean to us, as you talked about, Nicole, and more specifically, what are the values that matter to us in our usage of the foreshore, in our interaction with the foreshore. And I think one of the great things about your talk is that it brought out in a microcosm through the prism of ocean pools questions not just of in what way we interact with the foreshore, with the shoreline, but also some of the competing values that are at play there. I love the fact that when you showed the two pools, one was completely different philosophies of design, and yet both of those are loved, both of those are appreciated in their different ways. So even within something as simple as an ocean pool, there is some complexity in the values, in the way people approach them. And I think there's increasing realization that if we are to adapt to sea level rise, if we are to adapt to the immense change that's coming to us in the next 10, 20, 50 years, then we have to start engaging not just as professionals, but also as community with those values, with what it means, and we have to make some choices. The only other thing that I'd like to say is that you brought out in your talk something about ocean pools that is both resilient and fragile. They're obviously resilient because they're simple structures. In theory, we could move them if the shoreline has moved, and yet obviously they're very fragile. And it seems to me that there's something about ocean pools that is a bit like something that the pandemic and this time of environmental change has showed us that sometimes some of the things that matter to us are not the ones that are most expensive or most lavish or even the most visible, and yet they require a lot of our attention because they are very fragile. I won't say anything anymore. I will now open the floor to question. Joe Garcia, would you like to add the question?
What do you think? do the people respect the coastline?
Do people respect the coastline? I think that, yeah. Joe, is that your question?
Yeah, another question. How do you resolve for example, erosion, the coastline?
Well, I'll answer that in two parts. Do people respect the coastline is an interesting question, and it goes back to what Abbas was just summarising so succinctly for us. I think we have to be aware of what we value of the coastline as a whole community, and some of my work has been trying to answer that question. But it's not hard to see that Australians and people in New South Wales in particular do truly value their coastlines and their beaches and the intrinsic beauty of the natural landscape along our coastlines. I think we do respect it in many ways, but what that means has changed quite drastically over the last 10 years. And we're becoming quite aware of it quite quickly, what it really means to respect the coastline. And I think modern design practices are sort of just coming up to speed with that now as well. And part of that is answering your second question, which is how do you solve the problem? One thing I would say is we're starting to realise that it's not a problem. The coastline is a natural place. There's changes. Erosion is a natural process. It's not a problem. It's a space of ebb and flow, and we sort of need to, that's part of us understanding how we value and respect the coast, embracing that it's a place of change. So I don't have an answer on how you solve it, but I think that the way that we're understanding that problem's shifting and changing, and you can't start to think about resolution until you understand the issues at hand. Design practices are sort of coming ahead in leaps and bounds on that, and there are some really fantastic projects in New South Wales which are taking a naturalised approach. So engineering coastlines to be able to deal with severe storm surge events without losing all of our dunes or sand. And part of that is landscape and vegetation and planting, and part of it is hard engineering, but doing that in a way that creates almost hyper-naturalised spaces that can have marine habitat, they can have planting, they can facilitate, you know, community access, but they can ebb and flow with the tide as it moves, is sort of a new practice that's emerging to deal with that.
Now, Sue Reed, question about Port Macquarie design. So thanks, Nicole, great presentation. Just a question about the Port Macquarie design. What design consideration, if any, is given to the ocean pool interface in terms of, for example, its ability to host, I don't understand the adjective here, sessile creatures. I don't know whether that makes, I don't know that word. Is that even desired? Does that make anything to you, Nicole?
I can make a guess that it refers to marine life creatures.
Okay.
And creatures that live in tidal areas.
Yeah, makes sense.
Sue, please tell us if that's wrong. But I will try and answer that question. Yes, Port Macquarie Ocean Pool did have considerations for habitat, and that is quite a difficult thing to navigate. The community had quite a desire for the pool to be used for lap lanes, which typically does not do well in hosting marine life. But what I approached that with was that a pool isn't, it's kind of a modern interpretation of a pool. It's not a single zone for doing one thing. It's a series of zones, and part of those zones are for the children's pool, which is sort of a slower space, less movement because it's protected by the other pools deliberately to create a protected swimming zone for the kids. But it created an opportunity to have sort of marine life habitat, and it also connected to the rock platform, which already hosts quite a lot of marine habitat. So yes, in that project, we did create instances where marine life could live within the pool, but also extend and bleed out of it. That project is sort of still in early stages, but what I really would like to explore further with it is how the outside walls of the pool could also be a host for marine and habitat for marine life.
So the next question, I think you've partly answered it, but I'll put it to you, Nicole, anyway. I'm wondering what this work has helped you understand about ocean pools as ecosystems. For example, does a clean pool tend to denote one that is kept mostly free from the non-human? Very interesting question.
That is a really interesting question and a good lead on from the previous one. So the two examples I showed earlier in my presentation was Bondi icebergs and Bermagui blue pool. And they are polar opposites in terms of that. Icebergs is lime washed, the concrete surface, it gets completely drained and gurneyed once a fortnight, sorry. And Bermagui blue pool is actually a really valuable asset in terms of it hosts a lot of marine life, and the local community who are the stewards for the pool there do quite a lot to foster that marine life. And although Bermagui blue pool can be drained, it isn't drained often because it would kill all of that marine life. So that's a very difficult line to balance. Like I said, pure swimmers often like clean surfaces. They don't want to cut their feet on urchins or oysters, and they just want to be able to use the space. And councils also want to be able to maintain it, which is in sort of opposition to it being a true ecosystem, which ocean pools can actually host quite a lot of life and be quite prolific in terms of the sea life that they have. So again, there's no hard and fast answer. I think that existing pools, there's a spectrum, and new pools, I would really like to see that there's zones where both activities can happen.
After mapping the 16 New South Wales ocean pools, did you have a favorite, Nicole?
Everyone asks me this question. I've got to say Bermagui blue pool is probably my favorite. It's stunning. It's a really fantastic pool in a great spot, but it's also, like I said, quite well loved by the community and taken care of by the community, and that's a part of it that I really love as well. And it's also one of the main pools away from Sydney that attracts equal amounts of attention. So I find it interesting in the way that it can be this asset that is a destination for people.
A question from Tim Perkins. Tim, would you like to ask the question, please?
Thanks, Abbas. Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Tim.
What's your understanding, Nicole, about whether it's the government, sort of what's the future of these pools, upkeep? And I know there's a couple of other questions that build on that same idea after mine there as well. What's the future of these pools? Is it a state government issue? Is it a local government? Is it community?
I would love it to be a state government issue. All of the pools are looked after by their local councils. And some councils do fantastic jobs of that. For instance, the Northern Beaches Council have a huge amount of pools. They've got a full-time team of staff who look after them and are constantly maintaining them. So they do a great job. And a lot of the councils have come a long way in what the pool maintenance means. They're a lot better at looking after those ecosystems that live in the pool and not putting in things that sort of kill off sea life. But there's no sort of, despite it being this really unique thing along our state coastline, there's no state strategic approach to them, or even like a Sydney-based approach. Certainly some of them have heritage listing, but it's sort of up to each council individually how they maintain them. And, you know, sometimes that results in councils decommissioning them. So some of them, you know, they try and close them down. In Wollongong, they certainly tried to, but the community sort of pushed back, and they've spent quite a lot of money upgrading their pools down there. So it's difficult, and to give you an understanding of how much, how sort of little support there is for new ocean pools, the Port Macquarie project that I've worked on is the first ocean pool proposal to come as far as it has in 50 years. So the last pool that was built was 50 years ago in Cronulla. My understanding of that is that it's a very, they're very challenging assets for councils to build, both because they're difficult to maintain, and they're also difficult to get insurance for, so difficult for councils to sort of cover themselves in that respect, which is an unfortunate hurdle in some ways, because there's multiple attempts by various communities which have been documented over the years trying to build new ocean pools. They just never seem to get over the line. But hopefully in Port Macquarie we will see that.
Thanks, Nicole.
If I can add, this is something, something Nicole and I had a quick discussion about a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about this talk. And I think the issue of building new ocean pools bring out things that I thought echoed other wider issues with our institutional arrangements in terms of dealing with coastal issues generally. And I think the thing about local council being reluctant to build a new pool, to accept community requests for building new pools, partly because of insurance issues, really means in some way that there's if we want something like this to happen, it would need to be through a larger scale intervention on the part of the state government, for example, because often local governments are not able to deal with the legal and financial consequences of those. And that's a problem that occurs quite widely in a lot of issues to do with sea level rise. So a lot of the decisions that local councils do to do with long-term planning on sea level rise are often can be the wrong decision, partly not because the local councils don't want to do the right decision, but it's because there is no coverage, legal coverage for the councils from higher tiers of government. So I think that's a really interesting issue, and I think it reflects more on our institutional arrangements to do with how we manage the coastline, not just about ocean pools. So John Curry.
Yeah.
Hi, John. Yeah.
And thank you, Nicole. Just following on from Tim's question, particularly in terms of state government recognition and heritage protection for these assets, my experience in the Illawarra is that local council is very unwilling to push to support state heritage listing of local pools because of the issues around maintenance. But at the same time, council has suffered, as you probably understand, a pushback from the community when they tried to introduce what was going to be called a run to fail policy. So your views on the role of state heritage protection would be most interesting. Thank you.
Well, state heritage protection, first and foremost, is a formal recognition of an asset or a place that we value and that is worth conserving and protecting. So, I mean, in that sense, a state heritage listing is important because it recognises that and, would prevent a run-to-fail approach. But I understand council's hesitation as well, because heritage listings necessarily put on a great deal of admin in terms of caring for that pool. In saying that, though, Wiley's Bars is a heritage listed pool and works are often undertaken to that pool, to my knowledge, and they don't have to go through that process. So it may not be the massive barrier that council is concerned it will be, but it serves its purpose in terms of acknowledging that it's an important space, acknowledging that it's a valued space, and that the community wants to conserve it. But it's definitely a complex issue. There was in 1994 a fantastic study commissioned by the New South Wales National Trust, and they surveyed all of the pools in the Sydney metro area, specifically to assess their potential for heritage significance. And a few of them were heritage listed as a result of that, but unfortunately it didn't extend down into the Illawarra. It's possible that anyone could really draw on the research I've done to do that now. Part of it is that there's a great deal of resources involved in just getting around and seeing them and understanding them. So that was the point of my research, to create that record and asset. So if that ever was done in the future, it's all there and waiting.
she asked a question earlier about what design consideration, if any, is given to the ocean pool interface. In terms of the, she specified later, I was thinking, she said, of the external face to the ocean. Would you like to comment on that, Nicole, specifically, or do you feel you've answered that already?
Yeah, no, I can talk about it a little bit more, probably a bit more broadly. In the instance of Port Macquarie, I think that that is something, again, that will develop more as that project goes on, but it's certainly an ambition. I've also been working in collaboration with Tom Heath, who is a marine scientist who works in South of Sydney. He did a fantastic project in Cars Park. If anyone knows of it, or if you don't, I really recommend you go and have a look at it. That's a fantastic example of not an ocean pool, but a foreshore area where intertidal pools were created specifically so that habitat could be hosted in there. And I'm not sure if this is what Sue is completely getting at, but one of the things we have in Sydney is a lot of foreshore where a seawall is just belted along the water's edge, and that doesn't often host marine life or create a good habitat. So Tom Heath is certainly looking at some really interesting options of sort of softening that edge and broadening it. It's still, you know, a sandstone, it's sort of benched sandstone tidal platforms, and they fill and then empty as the tide goes up and down. But that's this idea that I've been talking about of an engineered but naturalized foreshore, which can host habitat, it can host the community access. It sort of does more than what a natural environment would be and is more resilient, but it also follows all of those natural processes. And I think that's where Port Macquarie for sure should be headed.
And we've got a response from Sue saying, yes, Tom Heath's project sounds fantastic. Right. We'll check it out. Now, a question from about the Clovelly pool from Natalie Pearson. Natalie, would you like to ask the question?
Oh, hi. I don't have a very detailed question. I just missed the start of your talk, and I wasn't sure if you had included Clovelly in your list of ocean pools. I couldn't see it on that fantastic graph that you showed. So I was just wondering whether you see it as an artificial pool or a natural pool, or whether it's included in your data set at all.
Thanks for your question, by the way. That one I didn't include because two reasons. Clovelly is technically a deep bay, and the pool itself is a bit removed from the water. It's sort of set up on the concrete concourse. So just for sort of the hard definition that I was running for the ocean pools I did look at, unfortunately Clovelly didn't make the cut. But conversely, I think Clovelly is a really interesting study for that edge condition with the water, the way the concrete comes down. Obviously, you know, it's a hugely popular spot, and it does a lot for community amenity and makes it much easier for people to access the water and all of the access people have to snorkeling and marine life. And those ideas, I think, you know, for all those reasons, it would be a really interesting part of the study. I just, unfortunately, I had to be a bit cutthroat about what I did and didn't include in the scope in the end. But that's not to say that Clovelly isn't valid or interesting at all. It's quite relevant.
Now, Nicole, I have a question. How do you see ocean pools in the context of sea level rise? So do you see them as the first thing that's going to go, or how is it something that you've thought about at all beyond the immediate conflicts and design issues about existing pools now? Looking into the future, how do you see them evolving?
I think they are vulnerable to storm surge. So I think if we keep getting really big east coast lows, it's going to start putting a lot of pressure on them. And certainly the progressive sea level rise will change them phenomenally, because that relationship between seawall and the pool bottom and how it drains and how it works with the tides is so, it's so sensitive, so that any sort of sea level rise change will sort of affect how they all work. They may not flush as well. They may sort of need a lot more maintenance. Of course, it's not the first time that an ocean pool will have its bottom raised and the wall around the edge increased in height. That's certainly possible. But in my mind, that it sort of just starts heightening all those pressures that they currently face. Maintenance costs, compliance with regulations, insurance. So I think that they might be the first to go, but not necessarily because of the tangible outcomes of that, but maybe the intangible ones of does the council have enough resources? If they upgrade it in a rudimentary way, does that lose what we love about it? That's kind of the most interesting thing, I think, not really about building new pools, but how do we maintain our old ones if we can at all? And how can we do it in a sensitive way, in a way that maintains all those values? And look, it's possible. There's definitely ways to do it. The other thing that's a really common occurrence for our ocean pools is you often see next to the current day ocean pool, maybe 2 or 3 ghost pools next to it, which are old manifestations of pools that people have built over the years, and then it's gone in, it's been decommissioned, or it stopped working, so they've just either adapted it or built something next door to it. So they've got histories of sort of being reinvented and revived as the years go on, and I think they've got great capacity to do that. In fact, I think if you built a new ocean pool, it would be really interesting to design one for a long lifespan. It could be a concept like a rice paddy, where the bottom ones slowly flood as sea level rise comes in. They get given over to the marine habitat, and you have higher ones up that start, becoming more active as sort of the years go on. So ideas like that might be sort of where I see the future of them going, or I hope to explore.
Yeah. I know when we talked a couple of weeks ago, and tell me if you don't want to be drawn on this, you mentioned something about the link to the Indigenous past in terms of the location of these pools. And you said something about there's some evidence that there's some continuity in terms of the location of those ocean pools with some activity related to the oceans and indigenous practices related to the ocean. Would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
So I tried to sort of hint at that at the start of my presentation. There is evidence of many of, or some of the pools at least, that they used to be on a site either of Aboriginal significance, so it used to be a place for women's business, or it was a fish trap. And we just haven't looked at that in greater detail. And I think that would be an incredibly interesting piece of work, not only just as a documentation of that history, but also in the same way I'm trying to understand what we value about our ocean pools. It would be a great exercise to understand that and understand how they've been managed or used by Aboriginal people over a much deeper span of time. And that's because it goes to all of the things about living in or habitating an intertidal space. How do you manage sort of those shifting changes, not over a 200-year span, but over 2,000, 20,000, huge time spans, deep time? I think that would be a really, really valuable and valued piece of work to do. And if anyone has started doing work on it, I'd love to talk to them. Since talking to you, Abbas, I did find that on the state heritage listings is the entrance ocean pool for that very reason. It used to be a fish trap. And the same for Mackay's Ladies Bars. That used to be a place of women's business. And the whole Coogee Bay really was quite endemic. So yeah, I think that's really interesting and valuable. And sea country, there's some beautiful parallels in terms of the way that we engage with our coastlines, in the way that Aboriginal people talk about sea country. So that would be a great piece of work.
On this note, going back hundreds of years to the back in history, and if you can join me, please. I don't know what's the protocol in Zoom for sounding the loudest possible clapping for Nicole. Thank you very much. I'm going to use my microphone with a clap, good old-fashioned way. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Thank you.
That was absolutely fascinating, beautiful research, beautifully conveyed, and thank you to the audience for wonderful questions that made the talk even more engaging than it actually is. I just would like to finish on a note, just tell you something about the Critical Companion series before I let you go. And I'm reading a blurb here. Forgive me, because I don't think I have the mental capacity to turn the blurb into my own words at this stage. So I'm going to read the blurb. The Critical Companion series celebrates innovative and rich thinking. The series aims to traverse disciplinary silos to provoke different perspective and invite new conversation, which is certainly and these are my words now, it fits well with the SCIs, with the Sydney Environment Institute mission and activities. So critical companions are individuals within the Sydney Environment Institute's network that inspire others with their unique methodology to stretch horizon and strengthen thinking. And I'm going to skip a few things here. Our next critical companion lecture, this is what I was wanting to get to, will be with historian Christine Hansen on the 15th of October at 4 to 5:30. Christine Hansen will dissect 100 years of data and story captured within the crust of the ridgy pearl shells. How interesting. Please register through the SCI events. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think that brings the talk to a conclusion. See you next time, hopefully.
Thanks, Abbas. Thank you, everyone.